now that wasn't in a minute ago. But so to everyone who is online or maybe just joining us online, welcome or welcome back. The final event of the Loose Hall portion of the day is this panel on the efforts of journalists to cover or maybe uncover the Uyghur genocide and its various elements. To moderate this event, we've invited James McCauley, who's a journalism fellow at Yale, as well as the global opinions columnist for the Washington Post, to serve as moderator. And I've mentioned, as you may have just heard me, that Gulchera Hoja has returned to, is willing to share her own experience in this realm as a journalist too. So the format will be that once James takes over, he can say a word or two about the other panelists. Then panelists, I guess, James, it's up to you, but invite them to speak a little bit about their own work, engage in a conversation. We'll all try to monitor questions and answers or Q&A on Zoom, invite people who are on Zoom to ask those questions. And but also questions of your own, questions of people in the room, and conversation on the panel as well. So that's enough for me. I'm not supposed to be moderating anymore, so I'm going to remove myself from the screen and turn it over to you, James.
All right. Well, thank you so much, David, for having us all here today. And thank you to our audience and to the Yale Genocide Studies program for joining us and for organizing all of this. It is a pleasure. It's also my pleasure to introduce our two panelists today. Bethany Allen-Ebrahimian is the China reporter at Axios, where she covers all manner of things to do with China, including the topic we're going to cover today, which she also has extensive experience covering previously as part of the consortium of investigative journalists China Cables Project. And she's also working on a book out very soon, it seems. So congratulations on that. About, well, I plan on asking you plenty about that too. Tentatively titled Beijing Rules, Capitalism, Coronavirus, and China's Quest for Global Influence. We're also joined today by Megha Rajagopalan, who is an investigative reporter for BuzzFeed out of London. And she was part of a Pulitzer Prize winning team for an incredible investigative project that BuzzFeed has done about Xinjiang and this whole topic, which, I mean, if anyone in our audience is unfamiliar with these reports, you absolutely must read them. They are formidable. So congratulations, Megha, to you on that amazing reporting. All right, so I think what I will do just to start us off is maybe if each of you could talk just a little bit about the reporting that you've done and sort of explain to our audience, what it is that you have covered most specifically. We can start with that, and then I want to ask you some questions about how you went about reporting those stories, because our theme today is really how we know what we know about this ongoing atrocity. And I think that even those of us who do follow the news are often a bit confused as to how that reporting actually happens. And I think that we would all love to hear you both talk about that. So maybe Megha, you could start with just a little description of the reporting you've done and what it's been about so far.
Sure. So yeah, well, first of all, thank you so much, James, for that very kind introduction. And thank you everyone for being here. I have kind of I spent really most of my career covering China in different forms and fashions. And I started reporting on the Xinjiang issue when I was a wire journalist at Reuters around 2012, and sort of reported on it on and off for a few years. And, at that time, things looked very different. There were a lot of issues that affected Uyghurs and affected people who lived in Xinjiang, ranging from issues around migration, human rights abuses, issues around public unrest and violence, and some of the same issues that we're seeing now around arbitrary incarceration as well. Around 2017, I was working for BuzzFeed. I had moved to BuzzFeed, and we had started to hear that things were getting a lot worse in the region. And I heard this first actually from a friend who is a reporter for another publication who had taken a trip out there, and they had taken this kind of road trip. And at the end of the trip, they had worked with a Uyghur driver. And at the end of the trip, the driver said, it's been great working with you, but I've just gotten word that I'm going to be sent for re-education. And nobody really knew what this meant. So I started thinking, I want to look into this. We ended up kind of coming up with our kind of first big story on this issue since Chen Quanguo took power and, started this kind of radical campaign against Muslim minorities in the region. And that initial story was focused mostly on the rise of surveillance technology there. But I was also sort of asking around a lot. I went to Turkey to try to interview people a little bit more freely. I was looking for Uyghurs that had left China sort of in the preceding months and then resettled in Turkey and felt a little bit safer to talk. So than they would have done if I had just gone to Xinjiang because of the level of surveillance that was present there and is present there. So then finally, I sort of met somebody who's like, oh, I know what those re-education facilities are. And then we sort of talked about it. It was in sort of the area he used to live in Kashgar, which is a city in the south. And, he gave me all these kind of geographical markers, like there's a hotel at the top of the street and you just walk south and so forth. And I went back to the region, and then I went back to Kashgar and flew in, and then sort of went on foot and tried to find it. And that was sort of the first big piece that we published. And then basically the reason I'm bringing that up is it sort of led me to the series that we did over the past 2 years. Our team basically like about a year after that, I ended up losing my accreditation to China, which is, I'm sure, something we'll talk about in this panel. Yeah. I met by chance at a journalism event a woman named Alison Killing, who is an architect and a geospatial analyst. And I started talking her ear off about this issue because that's all I was talking about back then. And she immediately said, well, that's so interesting. Has anyone ever tried to use satellite imagery to try to find more of these camps? And I thought this was really fascinating because it was so labor intensive for me to find just that one location. And there were other journalists that had gone, but it was all like very piecemeal. There were sort of less than a dozen of these facilities known about at the time. And we started with that idea, like how can we find all of them? I just thought, this is so crazy that in the 21st century, people are disappearing in the middle of the night, with bags over their heads and just have no idea where they're going and can't even talk about it even after they've left because they just don't know. So we sort of set out to do that. We tried some stuff that did not work. Like I had this idea that we should try to use machine learning that did not work. But eventually we sort of stumbled upon this thing that Baidu Maps, which is sort of, if you don't know, Google is blocked in China. So Baidu is sort of kind of a search giant, a Chinese search giant that has a lot of the same kind of functionalities as Google, including maps. We started realizing that over locations of places that we knew were camps, there were these kind of gray squares that were appearing. And we sort of figured out that this was censorship. We ended up collecting locations of a lot of these gray squares. And then we sort of compared those to uncensored platforms that exist outside of China, like Google Earth. And in doing that, we were able to sort of find imagery of more than 250 camps and prisons in the region, all of which were built after 2016 and are sort of part of the current campaign of mass imprisonment of Uyghurs, Kazakhs, and other ethnic minorities. So I'll stop there, but I'm really happy to talk about any aspect of that work.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. All right, maybe Bethany next.
So I first started paying really close attention to Xinjiang in around 2011 and 2012. I was not a reporter at the time. I was in graduate school in China and then actually here at Yale in the East Asian Studies department. And I took a class on China's ethnic minorities when I was in Nanjing. And about a third of the class was about China's Muslim ethnic minorities. So Hui Muslims in Ningxia and other places, and also Uyghur Muslims, and learning about some of the issues they were facing. And at Yale, I took a whole class on Islam in China by Valerie Hansen, great, great professor, really would recommend her. So then I became a journalist. I've been based mostly in DC during the years that I have been a journalist. And so sort of by default, my methods have always been somewhat, I guess, non-traditional, because I've always reported on China as well, but always, or mostly always. I've been on reporting trips to China. I've reported on Muslims in China, from China, but have pretty much always been based in DC. And so from the very beginning, I had to do reporting, on China and try to do it in new ways, using censorship evasion tools to find out what was happening in China, or just sort of, doing some open source analysis, things like that. In addition to talking to people outside of China about China. So some of my earliest original reporting on Xinjiang wasn't about what was happening so much in Xinjiang, but about what was happening to Uyghurs outside of China. So in early 2018, I wrote a piece about how Uyghurs in France and the US were being contacted by public security bureaus in Xinjiang, and they were kind of being coerced into sending their personal information. So like, photos of their driver's license, of their house. They had to, a lot of them had to go and stand in front of like monuments in the city they said that they lived in to prove that they were actually living there. They had to send just all kinds of very invasive information. And at the time, that was the first article about it. I didn't really know what it was, and neither did the Uyghurs that I spoke to, but they said, it seems like they're putting together some kind of a global registry of Uyghurs, So then, and, as this kind of goes along and I continue to do that kind of reporting, there was the RFA did, the very first story on the camps. Then we got, the first beginnings of looking at satellite imagery with like a student at Columbia named Sean Zhang, who was just literally like, I'm going to like search this. And he found what he wrote a blog post. I think he published it on Medium being like, I think these might be camps, guys. And then, just I think 30 or 40. And then Adrian Zenz, who's an independent researcher, kind of looked into that. So we got some early sense that this might be pretty big scale. So this was happening. Megha had her really astonishing, to me, it was the first big on the ground piece on Xinjiang, the sort of the tech dystopia look. There was that piece, and she got kicked out. So we're getting like a more and more of a sense. And then in 2019, I was brought on to the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists. We had gotten a trove of classified Chinese government documents of two different kinds. One of them was what we, I think it was called it was at the top of the document, it was called like a telegram, but what we came to call it was basically an operating manual for the camps. And it was an 11-page document, which is exactly what it was, the operating manual for the camps. And it was, all sorts of interesting and very frightening stuff, but especially scary because it was written in like non-scary language, sort of, basic party jargon. But it was stuff like, prevent any abnormal deaths. And you're like, okay, you're telling us that this is a vocational school, prevent any abnormal, are you allowing normal deaths? Like, what does that mean? And then you're laying out how there were different zones within the camps for people who were deemed more dangerous and more problematic, less dangerous, least dangerous. There was a point system. It talked about, one thing that really stuck out at me was this line, make sure there are no blind spots. So it was talking about security, about having cameras in every single corner of the camp so there were no blind spots. It was talking about, make sure that there can't be any escapes, make sure there are no escapes, and giving specific details on how cars should go in and out. And this is so for the first year after we started knowing that there were things called camps, almost a year, the Chinese government basically was totally silent. It had no position on anything. And then all of a sudden, in Megha, I don't remember the exact date. I feel like it was mid-2018. They started
November or something. Yeah, that year.
Yeah, suddenly started having this sort of very clear party line. Oh, these things, they're actually vocational camps. They're actually really great. We're very proud of them. They're counterterrorism. They're we're providing educational services. This whole pretty standard line. These are actually really great things that they're proud of. Oh, it's, we give them free. There was a white paper or some government official that said, we actually give them free meals and education. Like free meals was one. It was like, look how great we are, And so this document, it had a lot of stuff in it that was previously unknown. But what was so extraordinary was seeing this, and really the first time was seeing in the Chinese government's own words that you have to prevent escapes. Don't, try to prevent people from dying when you don't want them to, make sure there's cameras everywhere, this kind of thing. And then the other several set of documents was what were they called? They were basically daily intelligence briefings from something called the Integrated Joint Operation Platform, which is sort of like it's supposed to maybe sort of be like a predictive policing platform, but let's put predictive in quotes. It's not really predictive. It's an attempt to build up a system that vacuums in a bunch of data, or you can put a bunch of data into the system through all kinds of different inputs. I won't get into that because we don't really have time. And then it spits out information based on queries. So it's kind of like a giant database. And you can ask it things to sort of, like, give me all the names of all the people who, fulfill this criterion. And so we got 4 of those. And one of them was entirely focused on Uyghurs abroad. And it was like, it was like giving instructions about how embassies and consulates abroad can collect information on Uyghurs abroad. It was about there was one that was like, here are all the people in Xinjiang who have foreign nationalities, get them all. If they have not yet revoked their Chinese citizenship, get them all. Here's a list of people we know abroad who come back, to Xinjiang often and have foreign nationality, but have not revoked their Chinese citizenship. Put out an alarm for them when they cross the border so they can be immediately detained and put into education and training. And that for me connected the reporting I had done 1.5 years earlier about what was this global registry thing. So this information that was being collected from Uyghurs all around the world was being fed into IJOP, so that for numerous reasons, but one of them was, so we know where they are, so that they come back to China, we can get them, basically. Since then, my reporting has focused again on what Uyghurs outside of China are experiencing, whether on an individual level, harassment, surveillance, or attempts by the Chinese state to suppress discussion about Xinjiang, prevent governments from taking action on it, and suppress the narrative around Xinjiang. And yes, I'll stop there.
That is fascinating, and you've given us plenty to talk about as we go through the next hour. But maybe before we continue, Hira, would you like to tell us a little bit about your work as well?
Of course. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to talk to all of you. And using this opportunity, I want to show my gratitude and appreciate journalists as Megha and Bethany, who focusing on the Uyghur issue, and your work really bringing so much impact to the world, to better understanding what's going on in my homeland, East Turkestan, to the Uyghur and the other minority in our country. So I'm so glad to meet you in the online today. Also, we have before with Megha and Bethany so much conversation before we collaborate together, actually. So as a Uyghur journalist, seeing here's a more famous journalist, a more platform focusing our issue is a big achievement for us. As you know, I've been working in RFA 21 years this year. And only in this few years, we saw the more and more journalists interested in our issue. Before, even when we talk about the Uyghur, and nobody knows who they are and where they live, actually. Today, you can ask anyone who are the Uyghurs, they will say, oh, those people in China, human genocide by Chinese government, but it's not proud to say. We recognize as, the people who is under genocide, who is vanishing, any aspect, of course. But we did a lot, and you did a lot, but I have to remind you, there's a lot of issue we still couldn't bring out. And because of like Megha experience in China and Xinjiang. And Bethany says, yes, we found some very, good source to verify what Chinese government are doing is genocide and against, humanity. But there's a lot of things like what Chinese government using in the camp to those millions of people to drug them. What is that drug? Who is, providing that? And what kind of, work condition in those labor camps? What happened to those kids after separated from their parents? What happened to those women who've been raped and forcibly married to Han Chinese and who's forced to be peer of the Chinese Communist Party members to be relatives, and many, many issues. And because of language and because of, we know the language and we grown up in the Uyghur region, in our eyes, those issue is more clear than others. It's for sure. Excuse me. And some issues maybe in Western journals' eyes, just human abuses or something, but it's deeper than that. It's crime Chinese government are doing to our people. For example, maybe in some eyes you cannot differentiate, the picture from Chinese government's website or the news outlet putting propaganda says, oh, we're giving a work opportunity, job to Uyghur women, but you cannot see the headscarf of them. You cannot see the, beard usually they grow, the Uyghur men. You cannot see the Uyghur clothes on them. And maybe you cannot, feel there's difference, but Uyghur journalists, we can see the difference because for that you have to understand Uyghur culture, Uyghur life, because in Uyghur culture, we don't let our mother, elderly woman to work, it's so much shame for the man and so much shame for the son for putting her mom to work, even he can work. And for mom is after you, get old enough, your son, your daughter, you don't let your mom work like hard or condition like that. That's why it's for us like, wow, provide like work for 15 and upper, age women to work. Why? Where's their sons? Where's their husbands? This is the question we have in our mind. And where's her scarf? Our grandma, our mother never go out usually without scarf because they're all Muslim. And even in the cities, after they're getting old, because of their maybe workplace, they don't allow to show their, Muslim or their ethnic identity. But after they retired, they go back to their, the culture. They wear long clothes, they wear scarves. So when we saw the picture, we immediately can feel, oh, they are forced to work, So for the journalists, just as another Uyghur journalist, I want to remind you, before you want to, bring truth to the world about the Uyghurs, you have to study Uyghur culture, Uyghur lifestyle, and it will help you work, much better. And there's a lot of scholars also who are study Uyghur culture abroad. You can also get touch with them to ask their opinion, I think. And another thing is we have a very a key role playing in the media who are suffered from the, the camps, survivor. Those survivors have a lot to say because of they don't have English or other language to giving you what they experienced fully. So they need you to have much more time to talk with them, to patient to talk with them. Because every time I spoke to them, they said, oh, I wish this journalist could ask me that question. This journalist ask me those questions. They every time after spoke to Western journals seems to not enough time for them.
Sorry.
So it's very important to giving them a voice for the media to cover all those issues. And thank you all, my fellow journalists, friends, to taking risk to report about Uyghur genocide. And we have to remember, we have to continue. There's a lot we have to do. Yes, thank you.
Thank you so much for that. And before we go on, I just want to apologize. When you started speaking, I called you Hira Joffrey, but that is Gulchera Hoja. I'm so sorry. I just read the wrong label on the Zoom. So please forgive me, and we will continue now. So if we could maybe return a little bit to the question of, you all have told us in different ways about the challenges of reporting on this one very difficult and very sensitive story. But, you are all experts. I am not, and many of our viewers are not nearly as well versed as you are. So I wonder if you could just start by telling us, the very basics of what it's like to report on this story. First of all, Megha, you mentioned specifically with your, like for instance, with your dystopia piece that you got kicked out of China ultimately. And I wonder, how, could you just tell us a little bit about what it's like to report in that context just to begin with, and what sort of has to be done to report on something like this that doesn't fit the official narrative, and how you make that all happen? Because I think that that's a huge challenge, and probably one of the biggest ones, I would imagine.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I should caveat this by saying I'm quite out of date now because I left not by my choice in 2018, I believe. So it has been a couple of years for me. Mm-hmm. Having said that, yeah, I mean, I can give you sort of a sense. I think things have sort of changed a bit since the pandemic, probably for the worse, I think, in terms of access, not just in Xinjiang, but really everywhere in China. But I think one of the biggest obstacles, just in practical terms in reporting on this issue has just been journalists physically getting there. And I think now that this has become this big news story that a lot of people really care deeply about in the best way, I think some of that has diminished because news organizations are willing to take on more costs to be able to cover it. But I think sort of in the early kind of months and years of this crackdown, it was very hard because you basically, if you were based in Beijing, you had to then convince your boss or whoever does your expenses that you could take like $1,000 flight to Urumqi in order to try to report. And then you might not actually get anything because when foreign journalists go to Xinjiang, they're quite often, they'll be followed, they will be detained. I don't really know anyone who's been there that hasn't been detained. And these things are sort of intimidation measures there, but I think more importantly, they are used as ways to sort of disincentivize anyone from cooperating. It creates this huge ethical problem for journalists because you don't want someone to get into trouble with the police just for speaking to you, right? And then for sources, like for anyone that you would try to talk to, like on the street and stuff like that, they have to then think about their safety. They have to exercise a lot more caution. I remember when I took that trip in 2017, I was talking to an owner of a nearby business to the camp that I was visiting, and he basically I sat in his business for, an amount of time. We did a lot of small talk. And then once he figured out what I was doing, we ended up going out back, and it was specifically to evade what he felt was eavesdropping or surveillance cameras. And this was in his own business. So that's sort of like the level of of difficulty, I think. I think a lot of us in different ways, particularly Gul and her colleagues at RFA have done a really unbelievable job getting around these constraints with really dedicated phone work and amazing networks of contacts. Bethany has also, of course, been able to do a lot of really innovative reporting using leaked documents. So I think there are ways around this, but I feel that there's sort of personally that there's no substitute for on the ground access. And I think, a lot of the kind of gaps in our understanding of what's happening there that Gul has just pointed out, I think a lot of that comes from the fact that there is no way to report there independently on the ground, I think, to the extent that is needed.
Yeah. Bethany, on the subject of leaked documents, those obviously afford us a certain window into many things. How have you found working with those as a way into the story?
I like working with documents. It's one of my favorite things to do because, documents are hard evidence. You can't really discredit a document. The Chinese government can say they can just sort of have a blanket statement that's like, you're wrong. But, you're like, no, I'm not. Here's the chop, here's, this is the thing. And I like that. The trick is knowing that knowing how you got them and understanding, and authenticating them, and then, figuring out what they are and what the important thing is, that the important thing in there is. But I really like working with documents as a source. On the topic of, the difficulty of reporting on Xinjiang, I've only been there once. I'm also now banned from China, so presumably I will never go. But what is the power of the Chinese government outside of China really matters so much in the ability of them to restrict information, because
that's fascinating. Yeah.
Yeah. Not only is Xinjiang itself locked down, but they have managed to keep so many, camp former detainees in Xinjiang. They used to be able to get out, never easily, but there used to be more of them, and then, going to Kazakhs, being able to go to Kazakhstan, because it's not just Uyghurs, it's also other ethnic groups. So Kazakhs and Tajiks and others. So there's a disproportionate number of our survivor testimonies that are from Kazakhs in Kazakhstan, because they have a country. They're not a stateless people, they have a country, and same with Tajiks and Kyrgyz and stuff. But the Chinese government's ability to shut that down, and then to get these governments in Central Asia to send people back, they've really put a ton of effort into that over the past 3 years. And I just did a piece this week. I just published a piece this week about a Kyrgyz man, Chinese national, who was in a camp, who is Kyrgyz, who was able to leave because of his Kyrgyz wife, basically, and because he's ethnic Kyrgyz, able to get to Kyrgyzstan. But during the time he was in Kyrgyzstan, there were 1,000 Uyghurs in Bishkek, the capital, when he got there. And by the time he left, there were 300. Where did they go? And it's even worse in Tajikistan. There's a case that international lawyers are trying to get before the International Criminal Court. They've identified 3,000 Uyghurs and others in Tajikistan who have been sent back to China. They were in the camps already. They got out. Many of them, some of them were in the camps. They got out, and now they're being sent back. And you don't even have to be a camp survivor to have that. It's just all the Uyghurs. Just trying to get them all back. And it is so hard now, especially with COVID, so hard to actually find someone outside of China to talk to who's been on the ground, who has been in a camp.
Yeah, so. Just briefly, could you, as a follow-up, could you explain a little bit more about what kind of further challenges COVID has put on all of this reporting? Because I imagine, there are any number of complications that have ensued.
Well, there's sort of two things I would say. First of all is just the total shutdown in international and domestic travel. Let's not talk about, authoritarianism, just the shutdown in travel. So people being able to leave China. You're not Chinese nationals are they have to get approval to leave China. Anybody now. Of course, many Uyghurs have had their passports revoked. So that's not new, but just so many fewer people leaving China, so many fewer people going into China. And within China, tons of difficulty traveling from city to city. I mean, cities have quarantines for domestic travel and other kinds of restrictions. So there's just that, very intense sort of, difficulty traveling. But also, near the beginning of 2020, around March 2020, and for several months later, China kicked out like, how many total American journalists did they kick out? Like 20 something? They just sort of wiped out, partially wiped out the American press corps. Mm-hmm. And overall, the restrictions on reporting specifically have gotten even tighter, more harassment, more surveillance. People are even more afraid to talk. It's so much more difficult to do reporting, even just over the past 2 years of the pandemic. This is all secondhand knowledge. I'm obviously not there. So it feels in a lot of ways like much more of a information void, not just Xinjiang, but other cities as well, but especially Xinjiang, of course.
And thank you for that. That's it's one of those things that, I think reading the coverage from afar, I had wondered about, but that makes a lot of sense. To return just briefly to Megha, something you mentioned, I mean, this is huge in your work, the notion of sort of like satellite imagery, geographical modeling. I mean, I'm fascinated by the mechanics. I mean, I have to tell you, I am no longer on the news desk at the Post. I'm now doing opinions. But when your sort of series came out, I mean, it was like a bombshell in our Slack channel. I mean, everybody raved about it. Everybody was jealous. It's an amazing piece. And so I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit more about the mechanics of that, because it's quite complicated and quite original. So I'd love if you could explain just how that happened. I mean, you said a little before, but maybe a little bit more about how you actually put it together.
Yeah, for sure. Like I said, so basically we started with this question of like, where are the camps? Like that was the question we were trying to answer. And we wanted to find all of them. So basically what we ended up doing was like, we used this Baidu method to just like locate this data set. And what happened after that was that I should say we worked with a programmer on that, and he was the one that helped us sort of collect all of these images from Baidu. And then we sort of went through systematically and then kind of compared them to images of the same sites on Google Earth. So basically it wasn't really that simple, because the Chinese government censors like a lot of locations, like for other reasons, like because they may be a military base, or it may be something else that is like considered sensitive, but is not actually like an internment camp. So we had to sort of weed all of those out. Some of them were really obvious, like there just like wasn't like a compound there, or something like that. When I went into this project, like my background is like as a very kind of standard journalistic background. And then I kind of thought, we need to corroborate like every single one of these and with a second source. And as we sort of progressed, we ended up moving away from that to some extent. So essentially what we ended up doing, we sort of realized that it would be really difficult to corroborate every single one of them. But then we also found that there were things about these camps that we had never predicted. That, like, for instance, that many of the ones that were being newly built were being built in sort of the same way. So we started to find these patterns, like that there was one camp in kind of every county in the region, and that a lot of times the camps would be placed next to or sort of share facilities like parking lots and such with older prisons that had just been there, prior to this campaign. So once we started looking for these patterns, and Allison realized that these compounds were being built in sort of very, very similar ways, it started becoming a lot more easier to spot them. So then we sort of came to this issue of like, sort of how do we, like, ultimately, this is not us driving around Xinjiang and looking at these places, right? So we had to come up with a way to sort of be really, really transparent with the reader about what is actually the level of evidence here, what is the level of proof. And what we ended up doing, which you can see if you go to like the sort of the first piece in the series, is that we sort of created this map where all of the camps are sort of marked, and we essentially color coded them based on the level of evidence that we had. So for some of them, we had layers of corroboration. For instance, there was Allison's analysis of the architectural features, including the security features of the, as well as something else like a state media article, which were coming out sort of in the first 2 years of the campaign a lot more frequently, because they were quite proud of what they were doing. photographs from social media, other journalists who had visited this particular facility. And in many cases, we were actually able to get witnesses, people that were mostly Kazakh nationals or people settled in Kazakhstan who had basically done stints, like had basically been held in these camps and then had been let go as part of the very, very small minority of people that are advocated for by, you know, by a different government or by immediate family that's in another country and is able to leave. So in those cases, we were able to talk to people and sort of go back and forth between their interviews and the satellite images and sort of corroborate different things about these camps. So that was sort of one group. And then we have another group that we sort of marked as camps and prisons that we determined based on sort of their architectural features alone, that we could see based on, you know, the satellite images. And I think there's like a couple other things I just wanted to say about this. Like, basically, I think what we discovered that really surprised us was that, like, if by looking at sort of historical satellite images going back to 2016, we were able to trace not only the growth of the government crackdown, but like the growth of the actual camp system, which I never expected. We found that sort of in the early years of the campaign, the government was in this kind of frenzy to lock up as many people as possible. And they were essentially just dragging tons and tons of thousands of people from their homes, like in the middle of the night. And they would put them in these kind of like repurposed facilities, like schools and old folks' homes that they had just like slapped some barbed wire and, you know, 10-foot tall brick walls around and other security features. And, you know, the witnesses talk about this. They talk about this experience of being processed into these camps and herds. Like, people talk about, you know, hearing children crying, couples being separated from each other, like really, really terrible, terrible stuff. And then they talk about this kind of issue of overcrowding. And then we realized by looking at like historical images, like as the building continued, the government started building these new massive purpose-built facilities. And those are the ones that were really scary to see. Allison uncovered this, the location of this facility in a place called Dabanchang, which is south of the capital of Urumqi. And it is large enough to hold some 30,000 people. It is about as big as Central Park, which was really quite terrifying to see. And when you talk to witnesses, they talk about this as well. They talk, like, almost nobody that I have interviewed, I've interviewed probably dozens of people that have stayed in these camps, and almost nobody talks about being in one facility for the entire time. People talk constantly about this chaos and being moved from place to place to place. So I guess what one of my takeaways from this experience as somebody who, like I said, has quite a conventional background as a journalist, is that looking at these images, it like in combination with kind of traditional reporting methods, it allowed us not only to understand what these facilities are like, but to actually see like what the evolution of this program has looked like from above, and then also to be able to chart that from below by talking to people about their individual experiences.
Can I just jump in there and talk more about Megha's reporting that she hasn't mentioned, which is her amazing look at the supply chains and forced labor. So another thing that Megha has done is, and you know more about it, but I'm just going to talk for you. You can tell me if I'm wrong. But you've used like shipping records and like government tenders maybe, or like government notices and business registrations to connect Western brands to like actual items of clothing to factories in Xinjiang that are known to use coerced labor. And like that whole paper trail along there, Megha has also done really great and like amazing work on that too. Again, really interesting, very detailed, using all different kinds of records, all done from like thousands of miles away.
Yeah. Actually, Gulchera, I wonder, as we kind of near the end of our time, I would be very curious to hear your take on you know, what is most important to keep in mind in the kind of technological ecosystem we live in vis-a-vis victims' voices. So what is the most respectful and sensitive way to treat the experiences of detainees who have survived and escaped in coverage that we see in newspapers overseas?
I'm so glad you asked me this question. You know, I believe right now the whole world who's paying attention to the China or Uyghur region all learn what happened to the Uyghur. After that, they will start looking for why, right? So Chinese government also, right now, we feel working on that, giving you false information and the propaganda. And then by covering up the history, real history, providing you the wrong history, created history by Chinese government. And we should look up this part, I think. We all know it's a challenge to very more difficult right now to focusing on those issues, to covering those issues. But there's many ways to bring and continue on this issue. There's a historic part of Uyghurs' life before, like occupied by Chinese government. Why Uyghurs still fighting for their identity? Why, because of that, getting punishment, from the Chinese government? Those part we didn't do much work, I think. So I wish more journalists and focusing in the future about why all those things happening and why we suffering for. And by this, we have to digging up more true history books, and more evidence, study, and all those, as you mentioned, the survivors have experienced from the childhood how they treated by, in the school system, like bilingual, they said bilingual education system, but it's a pure Han Chinese like education system to change our people's mind, even their identity, to give up their true identity, even language today. So who are the Uyghurs? What role they were playing in the history, in the, the world? Actually, we have to light up the story, because all we're talking about from 2016 is sad story. It's very depressing, I think all journals feel. But we have beautiful story too. We have also very positive story. If you can see, especially the Uyghurs who live abroad during this hardship time, they still fighting for saving their identity, saving their culture, saving their language. They did a lot of stuff to keeping their, culture alive. So we also have to giving them some, hope to Uyghurs. There is a way you can survive. All Uyghurs need right now is a hope. Also bring all those sad story, all those reality, the world. We have to have goal. Why we did this, right? We need to save this nation, save this people. So the appropriate way is not about only to open this harsh policy, to report about the truth, what's Chinese government doing to their own people and Uyghur other minority. Also, we have to give a voice to the history, voice to our culture, voice to our language. I think this is another way, I believe. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that. It's very moving. I think maybe just to build on that, since we still have a few minutes left, Bethany, you mentioned earlier about all the work you've done reporting on Uyghurs outside of China, and I wonder if you might just tell us a little bit more about that, about how you've approached that, about what challenges there are. I mean, how you locate interview subjects, and what the kind of complications are with that story as well, because I imagine there are many others. So if you wouldn't mind just saying a little bit more about that, I think we'd all really appreciate it.
Yeah, I mean, I think Uyghurs many times, are parts of networks, and I will often hear about a story from, someone that I know, or from, someone who knows someone that I know. I connect with them, and they'll connect me to someone else. So it's kind of kind of word of mouth, I guess, that way. That's, how I do a lot of my reporting. Talking about I don't know if we have time to get into this, but about kind of the issue of Uyghurs outside of China, I think the issue of disinformation, Chinese government state-sponsored disinformation and harassment of people around the Xinjiang issue is really important, and has deeply affected the information environment, and also the lives of Uyghur people. A good example of that, is a number of Uyghur women came forward to speak about the forced sterilization that they have experienced in Xinjiang, witnessing rape within, in the camps, that kind of issue. And the Chinese government actually, in retaliation for that, or as a way to fight that, made public what they said was the private medical information of, these women, saying that some of them had affairs, one of them had an STD, talking about their fertility, totally not going to, it doesn't matter if it's true or not. It doesn't matter. It has nothing to do with what they said, but it just shows how the Chinese government has really very, very proactively worked to try to discredit people who are working, people who've spoken out. And I know that, so many Uyghurs and members of other ethnic groups in Xinjiang are afraid, even outside of China. They feel that they're not really safe. They don't necessarily even trust everyone in the Uyghur community. There's widespread, there's fear of spies, or just people who are reporting back. There's people who've come forward and said that they were asked to report back about their own community. So there's a lot of that kind of fear that you can't really get away from it.
Thank you, Bethany. I want to just put my experience also in there. Even Chinese government, still trying to silence us as Uyghur journalists. We are exposing the atrocity. They even label me and American journalists as a terror suspect, terrorist. And I am in their wanted list. Of course, it doesn't scare me, or can't stop me what I'm doing, but it will bring concern. Sometimes if I travel to some countries who close to China, for example, the Central Asia, Turkey, Saudi, anywhere, who the countries with allies with China, it's like disturbing, and it will affect my work. It will affect my life also. So how to protect those people, who is voicing for this voiceless people, who is reporting about the Uyghur issue and this atrocity. We have to have a system to, protect who's have a courage to speak out, also including the journalists too. I think if we have a solution for that, it will make more easy for reporting. It's also encouraging us to do more, I think. Thank you.
Well, let's see. We have just time for maybe one or two questions from the audience. So I'll pose this question, which is about reporting through an explicitly atrocity prevention lens. So the question is, do you think there is room to cover Xinjiang through an intentionally atrocity prevention angle? I don't know which one of you wants to take that. Maybe Megha or Bethany, who's written for American papers on this issue.
I'm not quite sure what it means, actually, but
I think it means. Oh, go ahead.
No, please.
If I'm not mistaken, I think the question means sort of reporting with a sort of like when reporting on a genocide or an ongoing genocide like this, how much activism should fuel the reporting, and what it's a difficult and different topic than a lot of other things that you might cover. And so, is your role as the reporter to be an activist in some way? And if so, or if not, is there any way to escape that, or is it totally appropriate in this case? That sort of thing.
I struggled with this a lot because I have covered it for so many years, and I became very emotionally attached to the story, as I think anyone would.
Who wouldn't, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I struggled with it because I was like, what am I? This is genocide. Like, this is like something that you cannot really be neutral on, I think. And I sort of have come around to the notion that there's room for both. Mm-hmm. I think there's room for journalists who have a more activist lens. I find that when you talk about organizations like RFA, like, it would be ridiculous to say you should be neutral on this because this is their families. Like, this is not something that is abstract, right? And I don't think that would be right to put that on everybody. In my work, I think we have tried to sort of really try to be objective from the standard of finding truth, and not as sort of representing both sides, not in that way, but to seek the greatest level of evidence for everything that we publish. And to me, that is sort of a kind of objectivity. And I think in the aftermath of this series and sort of all of the pieces that we put out over the last 2 years, I have heard from, just as an example, I heard from a policymaker that works in the diplomatic community that they were sharing the series with diplomats from third countries to say well, this is a real thing that's happening, and you could see that they have all of this evidence, and this is actually not a human rights organization. This is a journalistic organization, and it has a level of credibility, or it has a different sort of credibility than you would get from an organization that sort of set out on their face to in a more activist role, just to bring attention to all the things that are happening, with sort of less attention to the research side and more attention to the kind of raising awareness side. So I think sort of both kinds of work have their roles to play, and I think on this they've been sort of complementary as well.
That's excellent. Take on that very complicated question. So I think we are now at the end of our hour. Unfortunately, I could stay here all day with you guys. It has been fascinating. But first, let me just say thank you to our panelists, Gulchera, Bethany, and Megha. And again, thank you to our hosts at the Yale Genocide Studies Center for organizing this fascinating talk. So thank you all so much. And I hope we can continue the conversation before long.
And we're clapping here and clapping online. I want to thank you, James, for so nimbly moderating this. Really a fascinating discussion. I'll reiterate James's thanks to the panelists here, as well as to our panelists immediately preceding this. For me, from my perspective, as the director of the Genocide Studies program at Yale, this has been a really enlightening and surprisingly, as I think I mentioned this in the middle of the last panel, a surprisingly motivating and encouraging event. I feel that, I guess inspiring is the word. The work that you've all done in your own fields really does make me feel like there's good out there, and that the work that we're all doing is for something. That's not to lose sight of the underlying issue, the underlying events, and the underlying facts, which are daunting and indeed distressing and even terrifying. So I'm glad we were able to shed some light on them at this event. I'm even more glad for all the light that you on the panel have been able to shed on these issues and continue to do so. That concludes our events for the entire afternoon. Thanks again for everyone for tuning in. Thanks again to the Macmillan Center, to Hira Jaffrey and to Kate Pundick for all the work that they've done to bring this together, for everything from the audiovisual to interacting and making this a smooth experience for the choosing and selecting and making a smooth experience for the panelists. It's been wonderful. It's been a great experience. As always, working with you, and please keep your eye on for future genocide studies program events.
Right. Thank you so much.